All right, what's up, guys? Just getting started here. We're gonna dive into this video, and this is Graham Stephan's latest video. I think he posted this, let's see, 4 weeks ago. He's really dialed back on his main channel, which is really crazy. I hope he starts posting more again. I think this video, I haven't watched it yet, first time reacting to it. Basically, I believe the preface of this video is kind of comparing off of his last video, like renting versus owning, and he's, I think, talking about perhaps a mistake he made buying a property too early for his personal residence when he should have spent more time either investing in the stock market or realistically buying more real estate, because let's face it, Graham Stephan is a huge real estate guy. And with that being said, let's get started.
It's Graham here. So the other day, one of my posts on LinkedIn went somewhat viral on Reddit, where I said, if you were to buy $1 million home, you would have to put $200,000 down, take on a mortgage of $5,600 a month, pay another $1,000 a month in property taxes, insurance, and maintenance for a grand total of $6,600 a month.
Yeah, this is assuming 20% down. As a first-time home buyer, depending on where you live, you can get an FHA loan for 3.5% down. The biggest issue of FHA loans, which a lot of these real estate investors do not talk about, is the simple fact that they have limits for the loan amount. So they might limit you to a $600,000 home depending on where you're at. And it's, I do believe, based off of county. But I remember when I was looking in Denver, I was like, and they upped the limit based off of per door amount, because you can buy up to a fourplex with an FHA loan. The really big issue here with these limits is, like, in Denver, the real estate market had gone so far ahead of the amount that they were raising it, you really couldn't afford to buy anything that was on the market, like 2020, 2021, 2022, 23. I think now it might be a little bit better because prices have kind of leveled off in the last year and a half, 2 years, and it might have given them a chance. But I just remember when I was looking, you could not qualify for anything. So you could put less down, but of course that's going to add PMI, premium mortgage insurance, onto your mortgage, and it's also going to make your mortgage bigger because you just have more to pay off. But yeah, let's see where he's going with this.
Or he could just rent an identical home for $3,900. I honestly had no idea how controversial saying something like this would be, so I reposted it on Instagram, and I got a very similar response. Like, you didn't consider rent inflation over time, but you'll get a house at the end. Well, you'll get nothing renting. $1 million house appreciates $30,000 a year on average. No way could you rent $1 million house for that little. Come on, dude. So today I'm going to defend myself and show you with proof that renting in today's market could objectively be more profitable than buying a house. Because yes, you can indeed rent a one.
It probably is. I think ever since rates got above like 4.5%, it's been cheaper to rent than it has been to buy. But the question then comes in, because at least when you're purchasing a property, some goes to principal pay down, you get the equity appreciation, yada, yada, yada. The difference, or the delta between what you're paying for rent and what your mortgage and upkeep would be on the property, has to be big enough that when you invest that money, it would outpace what your property will be worth when paid off in 30 years.
$1 million house for $3,900 a month. The disparity between buying and renting has never been higher than it is right now. And maybe if you hear me out, you'll actually agree with what I have to say, because there's a lot of misinformation floating around on the internet. Although before we start, as usual, if you appreciate information like this, all I ask in return is that you hit the like button or subscribe, because it helps out the channel tremendously. And as a thank you for doing that, I'll do my best to respond to as many of your comments as possible. So thank you guys so much, and also a big thank you to Magic Mind for sponsoring today's video, but more on that later. All right.
Yeah, if you guys want to subscribe to the channel, hit the like and comment. If you have any questions, real estate regarded, feel free to go ahead and ask any questions you have down in the comment section, and I will get back to them. I don't get tons of comments on the channel, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I will answer them.
So first of all, let me preface this by saying that I understand why this concept makes some people upset. The average mortgage payment has nearly doubled in the last 4 years, housing affordability is near its lowest level ever in history, and the average income needed to afford the median-priced home is now $114,000 a year. After all, imagine paying $2,000 a month in rent with nothing to show for it, while your landlord gets to enjoy all the benefits of something that should be a basic human right: shelter. But at today's levels, if you dig deeper, you'll begin to realize that at today's prices, buying makes a lot less sense than it used to. And to break that down, just consider this. Overall, I found that there's this general belief that renting is always throwing away money, and buying a house is always a good investment. And even though there certainly can be truth to those statements, it's not the entire picture. So to give you a deeper understanding of exactly what's involved, let's begin with buying a house. On the surface, most people just take a look at the basic cost of a mortgage, compare it with the cost of renting, and then they think to themselves, owning is better because for a little bit more money, I'll get to call it mine. My cost is fixed, and after 30 years, I'll get to own.
Yeah, the big issue is upkeep, which is usually 1 to 2% per year of the property price. So it adds up to be a lot. Like 1% on a $400,000 home is $4,000 a year on average that you're going to have to pay, and just upkeep. And that doesn't include, like, if you hire someone to come mow your lawn for $100 a month, that's another $1,200 a year. And that doesn't include window maintenance. That doesn't include gutter maintenance. That doesn't include anything like if the roof doesn't hold up. You know, there's a million different things. That doesn't include pest control. If you're in the South, you need pest control. That's easily $600 to $1,000 a year, depending on what company you hire. The prices can just go up and up and up.
Own it outright. But as you're about to see, that's not entirely accurate. That's because first, you're gonna have to consider your down payment. Now, even though some companies like Rocket Mortgage and Zillow offer 1% down payment options, in most cases, lenders require that you put down anywhere between 10 to 20% of the purchase price to get approved for the loan, which could often amount to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars that's completely inaccessible until you sell. Second, you also have to consider the mortgage interest rate. This is gonna be your cost of borrowing money, and unfortunately, for buyers, that cost is the highest it's been in more than 25 years at just over 7%. This means that each and every year, 7% of your loan balance just goes poof straight into the abyss of monetary policy. And that adds up. To make matters worse, third, if you put down less than 20% on a property, you're also probably going to have to pay for PMI. This stands for private mortgage insurance, and it's an extra cost on top of your interest rate that you pay.
It's interesting that he said private mortgage insurance. I was always taught, especially in my financial classes, it's premium mortgage insurance because you're paying a premium based off of the higher debt risk because you're putting less money down. AKA, since you're not a bala and you're not putting 20% down, they're going to make you pay for it. Really interesting, though, that he said private.
Pay to the lender to protect them in the event you stop making your payments. This cost varies, but it usually ranges anywhere between 0.5% to 2% of your mortgage balance each and every year. From there though, fourth, you can't forget about property taxes. The thing is, with this, even if your property is completely paid off, property taxes are unavoidable, and it's usually based on your home's assessed value reappraised each and every year. In terms of how much this adds up to, it usually ranges anywhere between 0.3% if you're in Hawaii to as high as 2.5% if you're in New Jersey, which again usually amounts to several thousand.
I'm just gonna throw a little number out there. Texas was 5th from the top of like the highest property tax rate. I think it was at 1.5% or something, and it was really interesting. Invest with Ace. He's this other real estate agent. Influencer guy that is on Instagram. He did this fascinating video comparing buying property or a house in California versus Texas and which would actually be a better deal. And over the long run, because of things like property taxes and just a lack of appreciation in Texas, because the whole state's flat and they can just build more houses, and they will, and they have, the appreciation and lack of property taxes, surprisingly, in California actually made buying a house there make more sense. Now, granted, that did not take into account state tax levels. And if you're a business owner or a really high earning W-2 employee, man, California just takes you to the cleaners as when it comes to taxes between state and federal.
$1,000 a year, and it typically gets more expensive over time. After that, if you thought we were done, nope. If you have a mortgage, they also require that you have insurance. In this case, the amount that you pay is based on your home's replacement value, likelihood of a claim, and your home's location. And according to Bankrate, the average homeowner pays $1,428 a year for a $250,000 home. But when 66% of homes are said to be underinsured, expect that you'll pay more like $2,200 a year for the proper policy. And just like property taxes, these amounts are also going up over time. And lastly, though, there's also repairs and maintenance. That's because nearly everything in your property has a lifespan. For example, roofs need to be replaced every 20 years, usually to the tune of $12,000 to $15,000. Your water heater needs to be replaced every 10 years, and that's $2,000. Tiles will break, faucets will leak, and over the long term, it's generally recommended that you budget about 1% of your property's value each and every year to just things that come up that will need to be fixed. So with all of that information out of the way, here's how much it's actually going to cost you to buy the average home in America, and whether or not you're secretly getting ripped off. To start, let's take the example of buying a $400,000 home, because at 10% down, you would be out.
Also, I love Graham, but I swear sometimes, and I love him, I feel for him, and I hope he's not doing this, but I swear sometimes he just looks like he's just run himself into the ground. And I hope this isn't the case, but sometimes I'm like, oh man, I feel for him. And I know what it's like running a business and also being a content creator. Like, he really does a lot between the Iced Coffee Hour podcast, being a real estate agent. I guess he started selling again, an investor, and doing his own main channel. Plus he has like Bankroll Coffee and other stuff. So man, the guy just works like crazy. And you know, he's obviously smart, does a lot of good teaching people financial education like this. And sometimes I just hope he gets more sleep.
Out of pocket $40,000. You would then be receiving a loan for $360,000, which at a 7% interest rate brings your monthly payments to $2,400 a month. If you pay PMI, by the way, that'll be an extra $150 a month on the low end. From there, you're going to have property taxes at an average of 1.15% a year, or $383 a month. Insurance is probably going to cost you about $200 a month. And if we assume you spend about 1% of the property's value each and every year in repairs and maintenance, that's an additional $330 a month. This brings your total out-of-pocket cost.
Yeah, so I have an investment property that almost tracks like this exact equation. It's really funny. We have a slightly lower rate. I can't remember if we have I think we do have PMI on it. I can't remember if we got that off or not, because we've had the property for 2 years. We're actually looking at an investment property now. And I'm toying around with seeing what it would actually do tax-wise to actually get that paid off this year. But the numbers are so close. It's just uncanny.
Cost on the average home here in the United States at $3,463 a month with $40,000 down. And finally, if you'd like to take this a step further, that $40,000 down payment could be earning a 5% return in a high-yield savings account, meaning you'd be missing out on an extra $166 a month in income, bringing your total out-of-pocket cost to own a $400,000 home to $3,629 a month. In a location like Nashville, that means you could buy a place like this, or this, or this. Or you could just rent a similar home for $2,100 a month, which is $1,500 a month less, without tying up $40,000 as a down payment, and without locking yourself into a property that costs you 5 to 6% to sell. Now, I get it. I'm sure it's around this point of the video that somebody's going to say,
Web.com's AI tools make website creation easy.
YouTube.
Simply tell us some info about your brand, and the AI builder designs an eye-catching website.
You're an idiot, because with renting, you're making your landlord rich and you're left with nothing. But if you buy it, you're going to own the home after 30 years and then you pay nothing. And sure,
Yeah, that's literally me.
that is true. But remember, in the first year of paying down your mortgage, you'll have only gained about $3,656 in principal, or
And here's the wild thing. If you invested $40,000 and got 10%, you would have made roughly $4,000 in the markets. And in recent years, it would have been much better just to put every single dollar you had in the market. I bought 2 properties in the last couple of years, and we probably got like 7% appreciation on those, but like my market returns were like 85%, which is like insane. And I was lucky because I beat the S&P, but like even the S&P did like 30%, I think, last year. So
$304 a month, which is way less than you would have saved just by renting. In fact, you really don't start to see any mortgage savings over renting until about year 20, at which point it starts to become a break even. Like, just consider this. Option 1 is that you could buy a house for $3,643 a month, tie up $40,000 as a down payment, and slowly pay off the mortgage over time. Or option 2 is that you could rent a house for $2,100 a month, invest $40,000 in the market, and continue saving and investing $1,500 a month from the money that you're saving by renting. At that point, assuming you'd be able to generate a 7% return in the stock market over 15 years, that savings will have amounted to over $600,000 in cash, which would likely be enough to buy a home outright in cash when you're done renting. On the other hand, if you purchased a property during that time, even though you're paying down the mortgage, your mortgage balance after 15 years is still $256,000 on an original $360,000 loan, meaning over 15 years, your savings is only $104,000. However, I get it. It's also easier said than done. So let's...
Here's the other issue that I have with this current statement here. And I'm not saying that any of this is wrong, but one of your biggest costs of living is your house. And like you said, you get a fixed cost with a mortgage and your rent will go up, and you're assuming 3% with inflation or whatever. Depending on your market, it could be more, it could be less. The big issue is when you get to retirement, because then you have to factor in, again, and this goes back to like whatever the delta is between what your rent is and how much your mortgage and upkeep is going to be. Because if it's big enough where you can invest enough where it makes it that much of a difference, that's awesome. But if not, like, and when I say that much of a difference, I'm specifically referring to the amount of money that you need for retirement if you don't have a property owned outright. Because if you don't own a property, guess what? You're going to continue renting, which is fine. You can rent. Heck, John D. Rockefeller said, control everything, own nothing, right? AKA, have someone else put up the capital and you remove yourself from the risk. But the big thing there is like, is it going to be big enough that when you retire, and you're hoping that you don't have any crazy inflation or anything else go on, which if you live in a place like California, I guarantee you it will, because they have a very limited resource of land where they can actually build more housing without building straight up, which also becomes more expensive, which again just adds to the demand. However, what I'm saying with this is you just have to make sure you have a solid plan for when you retire and where you're going to live. Because if not, you're just going to get like absolutely slaughtered. And ideally you have more money, but it's like you're hoping things don't go wrong with like inflation or interest rates or anything, or that the market consistently yields over 8%. There's a lot of people, I believe a report came out from JP Morgan, that they think the S&P 500 for the next 10 years is going to flatten off and do 3 to 5%. And in part, that's because it's been so hot over the last 20 years. But over the last 20 years, we've also seen the rise of technology into corporations and that massive value add. And, there's people saying like AI is going to continue that on for the next 10 years, but it's really, really hard to say.
Bring up some other comments that bring up some really good points, like this one. You didn't consider rent inflation over time. Although before we go into that, all of this really goes to show just how important it is to stay focused and take in as much information as possible. Like if there's one life hack that'll exponentially improve results, productivity, and efficiency, it's being able to zone in on a task without any disruptions.
Okay.
Vacations ago, Madness, I really like your yes. It also has that they're slowing one of these before words a little bit, doesn't give you that scroll here,
No,
and there's only like it in more than 65 different countries. So it's no surprise rents do go up over time. After all, it's impossible not to see headlines like LA apartment rents hit record highs, rents back at record highs with more increases expected, and rents are rising faster than wages across the country. However, even though this makes it seem like rent increases are absolutely out of control, once you dig deeper, the reality is that across the United States, it was found that less than 50% of all landlords raised rents by more than 3%.
Okay, but here's the issue. Oh my gosh. So the big issue with that number right there, and that statistic, and there's a saying among statisticians, and having been a nerd and freaking college and studied data science, I can speak truthfully to this. But if you have one statistic saying one thing, another will say another. So, 50% of landlords didn't raise rents this year. Well, that means 50% did, right? But the big issue with 50% is you're not quantifying how many landlords own per doors, right? And there's a huge bell curve with like some people who own hundreds, like hundreds of thousands of doors in the US versus the mom and pop landlord who owns like one single family property, like literally me right now, right? So the big issue there and what comes in is how much of those 50%, like what percentage of the market actually had rents raised? Because when you say landlords, that indicates nothing, right? A landlord, like 50% of the landlords might account for 90% of the market. And that's the issue I have with this headline and the fact that he's even quoting it. Like, sorry, Graham, do better.
With the other half raising rents by less or even nothing. In fact, when you really dive into the data, one analysis explains that most of these headline rent increases we see are simply from tenant turnover, not increases on existing tenants. And most of the rent increases we do see were landlords wanting to have rental rates closer to the current market value. Now that, of course, doesn't mean that landlords aren't raising rents at all, because they found that 75% of landlords intend to raise rent at least something, but they also point out that smaller landlords are less likely to raise rents during the renewal period, since a vacancy would have a larger financial impact to them than an...
Exactly. And again, as a landlord, you're always battling trying to keep up with market rates, trying to make sure your return is good, not, also trying to keep vacancy up. And also, like, you just want to do good. You don't want to, like, overcharge the single mother that you're renting to, right? So it's one of those complex issues. And when you're looking at the really large scale, again, it's easier for a large landlord that owns a 200 or 300 apartment complex building to raise rates, because they constantly have people moving in and moving out, and he has more doors, he has more opportunity, and he can justify and identify where market value is for his property a lot easier, a lot better, and two, it's more feasible. If he has vacancy for a little bit, it hurts him a lot less than it's going to hurt you with 3 or 4 properties.
An institution where rent is spread throughout hundreds or thousands of units. This means overall, if you're a tenant who stays in the same place, your rent is unlikely to be increasing by more than 3%. And over the last year, rent growth actually went down by 0.8% nationally as more homeowners chose to become landlords in an effort to keep their low interest rate mortgage. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean that you're never going to see a massive rent increase or that...
Well, and that's just like supply and demand, right? And the really interesting thing with supply and demand, and that simple fact as well, is part of the reason why real estate prices and rent prices have been increasing. And I actually think rent has lagged a lot behind interest rate prices and real estate prices, in part because, one, real estate prices shot up so quickly, and two, interest rates shot up so quickly. So of course right now I think it's a lot cheaper to rent. However, and like the issue of renting right now is that it's so cheap, it's almost impossible for real estate developers or investors to go out and acquire more property, right? So we have this massive, what's the opposite of a surplus? We have this massive demand in the US. We're about 300,000 homes short of what we need. I do believe it's 300,000. And the issue is like, it doesn't make sense to build more property. You have to operate at a loss if you're going to build more property right now. So even though rents are lower, it kind of compounds the current issue that we have.
That a landlord can't increase your rent 50% one year because they feel like it. But even if we do assume the long-term national average of a 3% rent increase every single year, renting is still found to be $289,000 cheaper over 15 years than buying, assuming that you invest the difference. But you know what? We're still not done yet, because it's time to address this comment. $1 million home appreciates $30,000 a year on average. And this comes from the belief that homes generally appreciate by 3% a year. So how...
Which is inflation, so basically cost of replacement. So not that great as far as appreciation goes. Markets where homes appreciate more, and like, for example, Salt Lake is going to experience this a lot because they're running out of land to develop homes in that valley. Vegas is probably 15 to 20 years out as well. Like, they're developing down into Henderson in the north, but like Vegas is also in a giant basin. And when those basins fill up, there's nowhere to follow. And they're going to follow the same track that San Francisco did, where prices will go up exponentially because there's just nowhere to build. In order to build more, you have to buy a property, tear it down, and build up. So
True is that? Well, when it comes to home appreciation, the fact is there are a lot of variables to consider, like your home's location, condition, desirability, interest rates, and inflation, which all play a significant role in determining how much your home actually goes up in price. For example, even though home prices each and every year, most of that is the result of inflation. And once you adjust for this, you'll be able to see that home prices stayed relatively
that's kind of what I was saying.
flat for nearly 100 years and didn't meaningfully start to rise until 2001 when interest rates began to decline and affordability improved. This means, according to the Case-Shiller Index, home prices increased by 3.4% annually from 1987 to 2009 during a time when inflation averaged 2.9%.
Now, the wild thing here, too, in regards to home prices, is it's kind of like a material base. There's like the supply and demand issue of the land, which I think is just going to become more and more prevalent over time as the population grows, unless we face a population collapse in which all of these real estate investors, including myself, will be totally washed up. But what was I going to say? The other interesting thing there in regards to the homes is that older homes tended to be about a third as small. Like the average new home, I think, is 3,800 square feet across the US. 3,800 square feet, that is huge. Considering like the average home in the 50s, I think was like 12 or 1,400 square feet. And, you know, these homes are just massive. They're becoming less and less homes. And like, you know, 8,000 feet is kind of the standard size for what people call a mansion. And you're talking about 3,800 square feet. That's like half the size of a mansion, right? You know, people use the term McMansions for these really big, you know, fancy-ish homes in the suburbs. And, you know, the need for those resources to build those homes and so on and so forth. And it's really hard to tell what is going to happen because of the increase in home size and how that's going to completely affect the market. But I don't think it's something that is not going to have any effect at all. And like you can even see in Denver where people are tearing down homes and rebuilding 3-story townhomes that are like, you know, 2,500 to 5,000 square feet that are 3 or 4 stories tall with a basement, you know. And I don't know. I don't know what that means about humans. I don't know what that means as far as home prices go in the future. It's all just kind of crazy.
Suggesting that home prices actually only increased 0.5% a year when adjusted for inflation. But of course, to be fair, much of this really depends on when you start tracking the data. Like, if you start looking at this from 2013, we could see that more recently, home prices have outpaced inflation by 2.4 times, even though low interest rates and a lack of inventory is said to be the main culprit of this. Now, rents, on the other hand, have been shown to generally keep pace with inflation over time, and since 1960, nationally, they've simply balanced out. However, here's where things get interesting. Even though housing values have gone up 250% since 1990, the S&P 500 has gone up 2,818% during that same period with dividends reinvested. So if you had to choose between a lump sum purchase in a house or the S&P 500, as an investment, the stock market is a clear winner. Although I will say, as a real estate guy myself, I understand it's not as easy as a calculation as just that, since you're going to have to live somewhere and that's going to cost you money, so that has to be considered. On top of that, with a house, in most cases, you're not buying it outright in cash. Instead, you're putting in a small down payment and then leveraging your money for the rest while you get to reap the benefits of owning the entire thing. Because of that, one could certainly make the argument that a low down payment on a leveraged home would provide similar returns to that of the stock market, and you have the stability of being able to live there long term. But does that still ring true at today's prices? Well, to answer that, let's talk about renting. Fortunately, this one is fairly easy to calculate. The price you pay is the price you pay. That's it. There's no hidden cost of maintenance, rising property tax values, higher insurance costs, or repairs. It's just a fixed cost every single month, and you could come and go as you please. So given how simple this calculation is, that then begs the question, can you rent a $400,000 house for less than it would cost to own at $3,629 a month? Well, according to this chart here, the answer is yes. At today's prices, renting is now cheaper than buying in all major 50 US cities. And to show you some real examples, just take a look at this. Here's an 1,115 square foot home in Las Vegas asking $400,000. Or you could rent a much bigger home nearby for $1,995 a month. Here's a 900 square foot home in Nashville, Tennessee for $390,000. Or a home double the size a few blocks away for $2,000.
Well, and now you have this wild thing where you can't buy the property where you can rent it, but all of these people have 3% mortgages on really big properties. So again, like you said, when people upgrade, they don't sell the home, they just rent the home and move into a new home because that mortgage is worth infinitely more than, what they get from selling the home. So
a month. And here's my favorite, a $1.1 million home in San Francisco, where you could just rent something similar nearby that's bigger for $3,350 a month. These aren't just cherry-picked examples either. Take a look for yourself across the country and then compare those homes with similar homes nearby for rent. And I think you'll be surprised that renting a home today is significantly cheaper than buying it. And that makes me wonder, in what situations does buying a home financially make any sense right now? And what do I say to the comments that you basically lose the rent money? With a mortgage, you at least pay some of the loan back in interest. Well, here's the issue. The average American stays in their house for only 13 years before moving, and this means we need to compare that time frame with that of renting to determine which actually comes out ahead. In this case, assuming the same $400,000 home, after 13 years of making mortgage payments, your mortgage balance would be reduced to $276,000. At 1% net appreciation a year, which takes into account rising property tax values and higher insurance costs, that means the home would eventually be worth $450,000. This means after 6% commissions and closing costs, you're left with $423,000. Of which $276,000 is the mortgage, leaving you with $147,000 left over as profit. However, since you're required to continue making those average mortgage payments of $2,400 a month, plus property taxes, plus insurance, over 13 years, that equates to $465,000, leaving you with a net cost of $318,000 or $2,038 a month on average to say you own the house. And we are making some general assumptions that the real estate market is going to be going up over the next decade and that you don't have any unforeseen repairs or maintenance. But that also means that unless you plan to keep your home for at least 10 to 15 years, at today's prices, renting is the cheaper option. Although just like our last examples, it still doesn't end quite there. Unfortunately, buying a home is not a black and white decision.
yeah, I think it really just depends on what market you're in.
Since there's so many variables outside of our control, like interest rates, insurance rates, cost of building, property tax increases, rent increases, and inventory. But across a wide spectrum, here's been my experience and when renting is better. First, if you don't intend to stay in your home for at least 10 to 13 years, rents tend to be cheaper. That's because you're not going to have to come out of pocket for closing costs, escrow charges, title fees, and commissions that quickly begin to add up. You're not going to have to pay a 7% interest rate on your mortgage balance, and you're not going to have to lock yourself into a single property. Second, renting is also better if
The crummy thing that happens when you have a personal residence and you move is all of that amortization. So like every month you pay when you start out, it's like 99% interest. But like after 13 years, it's closer to like, 60% interest. Like you're paying more towards the principal every single month. But then when you sell the property and go get a new mortgage, that amortization starts over and you're back at paying, 99% per month of interest, which just sucks.
if you could earn a higher return from your down payment. For example, if you're running a business where tying up $40,000 results in substantially less income, that's a case against buying. We're also at a tipping point where a 7% mortgage is about on par with what you'd expect to earn in the stock market. So if you could get higher returns somewhere else, your money might be better suited outside of the home. Third, this one might sound self-explanatory, but renting a house is a lot better if you believe the market's going to be going down or staying flat. As of now, housing prices have completely defied the odds and kept going higher despite rising mortgage rates. But that doesn't mean this will continue to be the case over the next decade. Fourth, renting could also be better because you have very little responsibility and very little upfront cost. Like outside of fixing anything that you directly damage, a landlord's going to be the one who's responsible for all repairs, maintenance, higher property tax bills, higher insurance costs, and anything else. You're just...
Though everyone talks about cost when it comes to this, but honestly, the real issue is time, especially like, in my shoes, I was mowing the lawn last night and it was 2 hours, not 2 hours, but it was like an hour doing everything I was doing, overseeing all that bull crap. Not to mention all the money I've spent on freaking lawnmowers, blowers, and weed eaters. But all of that time was spent into just maintaining the property versus the time that could have spent as an entrepreneur actually like working on the business, or as an investor looking at different investments, how to deploy capital, all of these different things that just work against you when you do own a home versus renting. You don't have that headache. The landlord takes care of all of it, right?
Responsible for your monthly rent, and that's it. And finally, fifth, renting could also be better if you value flexibility. The fact is, with renting, you can up and leave as soon as your agreement's over. You can pick any place that you want to live, and changing houses is very inexpensive. Plus, when there's a lot of rental competition on the market like there is right now, you have way more leverage than you think to offer a lot less and potentially score a really good deal. But if you're in the buying a home is better category, I will admit, long term, over the next 20 to 30 years, buying is still the better option. Even though the future of the housing market in the short term is fairly uncertain, over the long term, housing has proven to be a fairly resilient investment. So the longer you hold and wait, the higher the likelihood of coming out ahead. The second, by owning, you'll be able to lock in your monthly cost until the home is eventually paid off. Now, even though property taxes, insurance, and maintenance could vary wildly, and they tend to only get more expensive, your fixed costs will remain the exact same throughout your entire ownership. So at the very least, that won't change. And third, anytime you buy
I mean, these are all like really good points. I think it also kind of depends like where you live. Like in the California example, it's not worth it to go get basically what'll be a $6,000 mortgage when you can rent somewhere for $3K. Especially if you're early on in your career still and building your career. It's like just more time you can either put into your business or at your job to either get promotions, have a sturdier business, whatever it is, versus, trying to make sure your lawn is mowed and you're not breaking any of the HOA rules and, taking care of all of those issues.
Buy a house, there's a psychological benefit of just being able to say it's yours. This one is a bit harder to quantify, but there is some sense of freedom that comes along with saying you own something, having it be yours, having total control over it, and not being at the beck and call of a landlord. Look, to be honest, as someone who's worked full-time in real estate since 2008 and who owns multiple properties, there is
YouTube.
about the fact that a mortgage forces you to save every single month through making the payments. For many people, extra money is spent, not saved, and in those circumstances, buying a property is going to be the only way they'll build meaningful equity in something. On the other hand, though, if you're purely looking at the numbers,
here's also the really big issue, like the majority of Americans, until you get like in the top 1%, maybe top 5%, I can't quite remember, the majority of your net worth is tied up in your investment property. So as fun as it is to say, oh, I'm going to invest the money in this, this, and this, instead of spending it on, buying a house, the vast majority of the time, people don't end up doing that. They just end up spending the money, going to the bar, going on vacation, buying crap that they don't need. And they get to retirement. They're like, where's my money?
the stock market has provided a higher return. It's more diversified than plowing your entire net worth into a single property, and it gives you the ultimate liquidity in the event that you need it. In the past, I'll admit, buying made a lot of sense. Inventory was plentiful, interest rates were low, and it was really easy to find a good deal. But today, with such a massive disparity between buying and renting, I struggle to find anything that makes any financial sense to purchase, unless you're looking for a primary residence that you intend to keep for a very long time. Even on the ownership side, I'm very much a numbers guy, and I'm shocked at how much my own expenses have gone up over these last few years. For example, my mortgage is probably the only monthly payment that's not gone up in price. Everything else, on the other hand, has. Like property taxes, I'm paying 15% more. Insurance, I'm paying 25% more. And labor, repairs, and maintenance, I'm paying 50% more across the board. Now sure, rents have also somewhat gone up, but when I look at the numbers and I compare a house to rent versus a house to buy, if I were to move anywhere in the next few years, I'd probably just end up renting it. It would save a lot of money. The issue I see today is that you have a lot of homeowners out there with very low monthly payments because they happen to lock in a very low interest rate mortgage. Those homeowners could easily afford to rent their properties out at a discount because even if they break even, that is better than giving.
And what he's not going to talk about is a lot of those people can get massive tax benefits from turning that property into a rental property rather than selling it.
up a low interest rate mortgage by selling it. That's why in my original post, this hypothetical owner would only lose $2,700 a month if they bought it at today's prices. But if they've already owned it for a few years, they're probably still making out with a pretty decent profit. That's why I don't want this video to be taken the wrong way, because under the right circumstances, buying still has a lot of advantages, and it makes sense. But unless you're certain that you want to be tied down to a specific property for a minimum of 10 to 15 years, renting has a lot of advantages, and saving money there and investing the difference could have a better financial outcome. A great way to calculate this is with the New York Times buy versus rent calculator, which used to be free. Now they're charging for it, so I went and paid for it just so I could use this as an example. But consider this. Let's say you're looking to buy a $550,000 house that would cost you $2,500 a month to rent. If you plan to stay there for 13 years with a 7.25% mortgage, a 10% down payment, 3% home appreciation, 5% rent growth, 8% investment returns, and a 3% inflation rate, renting ends up saving you $159,000 over that time frame. Believe it or not, in this circumstance, buying doesn't even begin to break even until year 29. And it isn't until year 37 do you see any substantial savings. On the other hand, if interest rates were 3.5%, buying starts to save you a substantial amount of money as early as 8 years, which is a massive difference. This is why buying today is a completely different calculation than you had to look into a few years ago. Now, obviously, there's a lot of variables that could change in the future, and there are aspects of buying a home that aren't purely financial. But from a numbers standpoint, it's more important than ever today to consider why you're buying, how long you're going to live there, what the cost of rent is, and if you could invest the difference. Because as you just saw, there's a lot more to the equation than meets the eye. So with that said, thank you so much. As always, feel free to hit the like button, subscribe, and until next time.
Okay, Fred, time to find our perfect apartment on Zillow. Don't worry, change will be good.
I got an ad at the end of his thing. Wow. All right, awesome. So I think that wraps up today. I mean, overall, that video there's a lot of really good information there. But I don't know. As far as my personal opinion goes, I think it really just depends on where you live and what your goals are and where you're at in your life. I personally like owning my home, although I do acknowledge there's been opportunity cost that comes with that, as far as I could have done more with the capital had I put it into the markets. And as far as that goes, I don't know. It's really hard to tell. It's not an easy decision to make, and I think it's, to each their own. And if we're being 100% honest, owning a home is part of the American dream. Maybe it was sold to us by banks. Maybe it was just something that we've always wanted. But it just seems to be something that depends on what market you're in, who you are, and what your goals are. And all I can do is encourage you to go and look further and research more before you actually make a purchase decision. Anyways, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel as always. And I hope you got a little bit of value from this. And have a great day.